Well, we'll go ahead and begin. Welcome. Good to see you all. Hope you had a restful week and are ready to begin this week, resting in the Lord as you proceed forward. We're going to be back in Leviticus, and hopefully we're going to spend a portion of our time, a good bit of it, in the book of Leviticus. So if you want to go ahead and open to chapter 1, verse 1, we're going to return to that section as we are continuing on our appreciation of Leviticus to understand why it was written, what its purpose is, and how it is a comfort to the people of God. I want to return back to verse 1:1 of Leviticus in comparison with Exodus and how Exodus concludes and Leviticus begins. These are not insignificant details, and I want us to understand part of what is being taught in the book of Leviticus in comparison with and in concert with the ending of Exodus. If you look at Leviticus 1:1, and I'm reading from the New King James, but the New King James translates it, "Now the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from," and the New King James says, "the tabernacle of meeting." Literally, this is the word tent of meeting. If you go back to the very last verse of Exodus, chapter 40, verse 38, a different word is used. It says, "For the cloud of the Lord was above the tabernacle by day." One of the things that we miss, and this is in the New King James, though I don't think the ESV has, or the NASB has this distinction, or it makes the distinction, whereas the New King James does not. But there are different words used here, and I think this is helpful for us to understand that there is a twofold purpose for the tabernacle for Israel. There's a twofold purpose, and these different titles tell us what they are. So in Exodus 40, verse 38, it's called the tabernacle. The word in Hebrew, I'm going to use a lot of Hebrew today, not to try to impress you, but just so you can kind of make some distinctions in your mind. But the word used at the end of Exodus is the word mishkan. And you can hear the Shekinah, that concept that we hear about the Shekinah, that's the mishkan. All right, so the tabernacle is known as the dwelling place. The word tabernacle in Hebrew means dwelling place. This is the definition of what it is to be, for the tabernacle to be. If you want to compare this, Isaiah 32:18 says, "My people will dwell in a peaceful habitation in secure dwellings." That's the same word being used there. Not necessarily of tents, but just a place to dwell or reside. Job 18:21 will use the same word. "Surely such are the dwellings of the wicked, and this is the place of him who does not know God." So the word itself just communicates the region or the place where someone would dwell. And in this case, this is God's dwelling place. It is the first dwelling of God, or it is first and foremost the dwelling of God. In other words, you might call it Yahweh's home. We also hear the phraseology in the Old Testament, the house of God, Bethel, Beth being house and El, God. And so this is what we mean when we talk about the house of God. It's where he dwells. But coming to Leviticus 1:1, a different term is used. It says literally, "Now the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting." And again, our New King James doesn't say tent. It, again, uses the word tabernacle, but more literally, it is the word tent. It's the tent of meeting. And the difference between tabernacle, the dwelling place, versus tent of meeting, the difference is one of purpose rather than a definition. In other words, the tabernacle as a dwelling place, that is the definition of a tabernacle. It's where God dwells. But as far as referring to it as the tent of meeting, we learn the purpose of the tabernacle. That is, it's where God would meet with the people. And so Morales says this in our book that we're kind of using. He says, "The tabernacle is also the way to God's house. That is, the way to God himself, to engage with him in fellowship." Stated differently, the tabernacle is not only God's house, the place of his presence, that's what tabernacle means, but is the ordained way of approaching the divine presence through the cultic system, which includes not only the tabernacle itself, but the priesthood, the rituals, the sacrifices, and the liturgical calendar that they would follow. So the tabernacle then becomes both the shadowy goal, the where God dwells, but it's also this typological or this symbolic path to achieve the goal. It's the way that you come into the presence of God. And so the tabernacle serves as both the dwelling place, but also the tent of meeting. How do you come to God? You go to the tent of meeting where God resides. So it's the temporary means, what is happening in Leviticus. It's the temporary way. If it is that, it can't be the final goal. It's only a temporary, or what we might call a typological goal of God's presence, but it is for the Israelites the way in which they can get to in some shadowy form, not the full reality, which is Jesus Christ. Morales would say in this way, Leviticus is about reconciliation. And I love this because sometimes we don't look at Leviticus in that way, but he says it's about reconciliation between God and humanity through that symbolic means of the tabernacle ritual or cult. As the culmination of the Pentateuch's primary theme, Yahweh has opened a way for humanity to dwell in his presence. Leviticus serves to explain how that way works. And so this is why it's not just meant to be understood as a book of rules, but it's how God is going to allow Israel to have fellowship and enjoy his presence. Leviticus answers how the Exodus tabernacle, how the dwelling place, as it says in Exodus, becomes Israel's tent of meeting. So if they weren't allowed in the dwelling place because of God's holiness and their impurity, now we find out in Leviticus how they can meet with God and how the tabernacle serves that purpose. And so it's not until Leviticus does it become the tent of meeting. Before in Exodus, it was simply dwelling place. But now in Leviticus, because Leviticus, God is going to provide the way, it becomes the tent of meeting. Through the rituals, through the sacrifices, through the priesthood and the calendar, is how they will meet and fellowship with God. So one way to see that the narrative story of Exodus is to continue, like I'm not just pulling this out of thin air, is the very first word of Leviticus is very striking. In fact, in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Leviticus, which, by the way, that's a Latin term, Leviticus. I believe it's Latin, right? Is that Latin? You know, come on, it's Latin. Okay. The Hebrew Bible names books by their first word. And so Leviticus begins with a verb, and it's a very strange verb. So the name of Leviticus in the Hebrew Bible is, and you're going to have to forgive my Hebrew here, I pulled it up real fast, Wayikra, and he called. It's the verb, and he called. So they call Leviticus, and he called. All right? If you look at Leviticus 1:1, it says, now the Lord called to Moses. And so the word Lord will be added later in Leviticus 1:1. Now this is important because the first word of Leviticus begins with the word and. Now, New King James says, now the Lord called, but the word now and are usually interchangeable in some kind of narrative context. I'm not sure if the ESV or even the NASB translate that word, so much for it being a literal translation all the time. But it's there, I promise you. All right, it's that the wa of the Wayikra. And so this is the first word, and. Now, what's significant about this verb, and I told you I'm going to give you a little Hebrew today, this is a special kind of verb that is used in narrative context. That if you were going to tell a story and this happened, then this happened, and this happened, you would use this kind of verb. But what's interesting is that he starts the very first word with a verb of narrative, which is to say he's continuing on from something else. What would he be continuing from? Well, of course, he'd be continuing from the book of Exodus. So we are to understand Leviticus as moving the story forward. Where Exodus leaves off, Leviticus begins. And this is a very natural way that it should be read. And so this is pretty interesting. I have a lot of resources that we could talk about this if you want to understand more of the Hebrew grammar of it. I spent some time in pulling out my Hebrew grammars and so forth. It talked about how this kind of verb traditionally, it's named various things. These constructions principally occur in relationship to a preceding verb, which there is none in Leviticus's case. And signify two notions at one and the same time. So in other words, it has to be referring back to the book of Exodus here at Leviticus 1:1. So this is pretty interesting that what we are seeing in Leviticus is to be assumed to be a continuation from Exodus. So Exodus, you have a tabernacle dwelling place that Moses couldn't go in. And now in Leviticus, you have a tent of meeting where God is calling to Moses, come to me. And so Leviticus is going to show the way of how we can go into God's presence, or at least for Israel. Now, there is also a similarity between what happens in Leviticus to also what happens in Solomon's temple much later. If you compare the events that occur at the end of Exodus and Leviticus to the events that happen in 1 Kings 8 when Solomon constructs the first temple, there's many similarities and many differences as well. And so if we were to compare this with, say, 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 4 through 10, you might see some similarities about God's glory filling the new temple and it was so full of God's glory that the priests were not even able to enter. So very, very similar to what we had back in the end of Exodus, that God's glory filled the tabernacle so much so that Moses was not even able to enter. And so what we have in 1 Kings 8, and we can go there real fast, 1 Kings chapter 8, just so you can see some of the similarities. Starting in verse 4. They brought up the ark of the Lord, the tabernacle of meeting, and the holy furnishings that were in the tabernacle. So we're seeing a transfer from the tabernacle cult to the temple cult. All right. It says, the priests and the Levites brought them up, and King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who were assembled with him were with him before the ark, sacrificing sheep and oxen, and could not be counted or for multiplied. So in other words, they already had the prescription in Leviticus. And so as God's glory fills the temple, they already have in place a means to come into the temple. And so God makes the new temple his dwelling place. Look at verse 12. It says, Solomon spoke, the Lord said he would dwell in the dark cloud. This is the word for where we get the word tabernacle from. Mishkan, the verb here is shakan. And so it's where we get the concept of Shekinah. All right? And so the Lord would dwell in the dark cloud. I have surely built you an exalted house and a place for you to dwell in forever. And so God has now went from the tabernacle, that tent of meeting, to the temple as his tabernacle now, his dwelling place. And so as we see back at verse 10, it came to pass when the priests came out of the holy place, because they put in all the furnishings into the new temple. After that, what happens, God's presence comes down. It says, the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord in verse 11. It says that in verse 10 as well, that the cloud filled the house of the Lord. So now that the ark and all the tabernacle furnishings are now in the temple, now God says, I'm going to move houses. I'm going from the tent to the building. And so we have this transference. And so the priests are forced to leave again, but if you read through all of 1 Kings 8, Solomon will pray, and the priests will follow the Levitical laws. And if you come to the end in chapter 8, verse 62, notice what happens. Then the king and all Israel with him offered sacrifices before the Lord. And Solomon offered a sacrifice of peace offering, which he offered to the Lord, 22,000 bulls, and so on. On the same day, the king consecrated the middle of the court, and so forth. In other words, they were allowed to enter back in. What's the difference? Well, the difference was they're following the Levitical way of making this place the place of meeting. It's not a tent anymore. It's rather a building, but it's the house of meeting, the house of God. And so just as God invited Moses in Leviticus 1:1, so are Solomon, the priest, and all Israel. They're already been invited through Leviticus. God's presence is there, and he is inviting them to come by way of the Leviticus cultus, if you will. So this is how Morales summarized. He says, Exodus 40 closes with a wonder that the Garden of Eden planted, as it were, in the midst of Sinai's arid wilderness. Israel's mediator, however, that's Moses, is unable to enter through Eden's gates into the glory of the divine presence. Here Israel is brought face to face with a fundamental question that has perplexed human civilization across the ages and cultures of history. How does one get back inside? Back to the golden age, back to the paradise of God. To understand Leviticus, then, is to understand the way of Yahweh, the path of life. And again, understand it's a shadowy, symbolic, or typological way. It's not the true way. It's a shadow of things to come. And so when we come to Leviticus, especially chapters 1 through 10, we are told the way. This is the way you come in, and it's going to be through sacrifices. Another Old Testament scholar said, with the institution of the sacrificial cult of Leviticus, Aaron, now not Moses, but Aaron has gained a new dignity. Like Moses, he has become the community's cultic mediator, a role that will be illustrated in particular in the ceremony of chapter 16. What is Leviticus 16? It's the Day of Atonements, and that was the highlight of Leviticus. And so we see this, that Aaron finally in Leviticus chapter 9, after going through all the sacrifices, all the rituals, all the procedures, and Leviticus 9, if you come back there, verse 22, we find that Moses and Aaron have instituted all these elements. And so Leviticus 9, verse 22, It reads that Aaron lifted his hand toward the people, having done all the sacrifices, blessed them, and came down from offering the sin offering, the burnt offering, and the peace offering. We're going to talk about those here in a moment. In other words, he left the tabernacle, he did all the rituals that God had outlined in Leviticus, and he blessed the people. Verse 23, and Moses and Aaron went into the tabernacle of meeting. They couldn't do that at the end of Exodus, if you remember. And came out and blessed the people. Then the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. In other words, God's glory was still there. But now, because they've done these ritual cult practices that God is going to outline in Leviticus, they could go in and out. They could be in the presence of God. They could meet God in his dwelling place. And it says in verse 24, fire came out before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat on the altar. When all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. In other words, they worshiped God. He accepted their sacrifice. He says, I've given you the way. You've performed it. You've done it correctly. And I'm accepting the sacrifice. And I will allow you now to worship me and to come into my presence and have communion with me. You are now back in Eden, typologically. Okay? And so this is the picture that we get from Leviticus 1 through 9 and even on into 10. Although chapter 10, of course, we know about what happens when you don't do it in God's way with Nadab and Abihu. So let's look carefully now at chapters 1 through 10. And for me, this is one of those times where I will admit, I will read through Leviticus and it seems so redundant because there's offerings and there's offerings and there's more offerings. And having a helpful understanding of what these offerings, these different sacrifices are and what they do, that does give us a better appreciation of the diversity of what is happening here. It's not that they do the same thing over and over and over again. There's actually 5 different sacrifices that Leviticus outlines for us here. And so I want us to look at these and see their significance and how it actually relates to a tremendous spiritual truth that I hope we will come to understand and appreciate. So as we come to Leviticus 1 through 10, this is where God has given them the ritual, cultic, sacrificial system that they might come to meet with God. Chapters 1 through 7 would consist of those sacrifices. Chapter 8 of chapters 1 through 10 would be the consecration of the priesthood. And so before the priests could do their job, they had to be set apart. They had to be consecrated. So you have the people doing sacrifices, the priests being set that they might perform the sacrifice in the place of the people. And then in chapters 9 and 10, you have the initiation of the tabernacle cultic system with Aaron first, and then with Nadab and Abihu second. And so entrance into God's house, we see in chapters 1 through 7, will require sacrifices, and many different kinds of sacrifices. And in chapters 8, we'll see that it requires a priesthood. It requires someone to mediate on our behalf or on Israel's behalf. That they cannot physically go into the presence of God, but someone can go in their stead and mediate on their behalf. They can perform the sacrifices on their behalf. And by that person's presence, you are therefore present as well. And that's the concept that we're going to see. So let's go through some of these sacrifices that we find. We can go back to Leviticus chapter 1 and notice that they're translated mostly the same in most translations, though I don't know that it's the best translation that are used. I'm not entirely sure why we've kind of fallen on burnt offerings and grain offerings and so forth. So we're going to talk about some of these. And if we come to chapter 1, verse 2 of Leviticus, the very first offering that Israel is presented with is known as the burnt offering. It says, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when any one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of the livestock, of the herd, and of the flock. If his offering is a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish." And so he goes on to talk about this burnt offering. Verse 4, "Then he shall put his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted." There is the first category of sacrifices known as the burnt offering. Burnt. Now, what's interesting here is the word for burnt is actually not the word for fire or burning. It's the word for ascending, which makes sense because when a fire burns, it goes up, the ashes, the smoke goes up. And so the idea of this offering is that it goes up unto God. And so you can think of it as the ascending offering. The offering of ascension is how some have put it. All right, so this is the first one. It is more literally translated the ascending offering. It actually comes from the verb alah, which means to go up. in Hebrew. The second one we find in chapter 2 now. It says, when anyone offers a grain offering. And the funny thing here is that the word is not grain, because it's just not. The word that is used here is actually tribute or gift. So the second kind of sacrifice is it's known as grain, but it's more technically the tribute. A gift of some kind. It's a gift offering. The third one we come to is in chapter 3. It says, when offering is a sacrifice of peace, also known as the peace offering. So we now have a third. And this one is correctly named and translated. Coming now to chapter 4, we see a fourth. Moses spoke to the Lord saying, speak to the children of Israel saying, if a person sins unintentionally, so now we're getting into something more specific. We're dealing with sin. If any person sins unintentionally against any of the commandments of the Lord in anything which ought not to be done and does, priest sins, either the people or the priest, bringing guilt on the people, then let him offer to the Lord for his sin which he has sinned a young bull without blemish as a sin offering. And this is the word for sin here used, so this is especially for the matter of sin. Some have also called it, although the word used in Hebrew is sin, they would also use it with the concept of purification. You might think of atonement. So we have a sin offering now. And then the final one we have is in chapter 5. If you go to chapter 5, and we're going to look through we're not going to read all of this, but in verse 1, if a person sins, and there's different scenarios about human uncleanliness and touching something that is unclean. Verse 6, it says, he shall bring his trespass offering to the Lord. This is sometimes also known as the guilt offering. So we have these 5 categories, and they're all different, and they all do different things. And so we have that last one being the guilt offering. Can be considered a reparation offering, a compensation even. It's kind of a strange one. We'll look in a little bit more detail as we go. But this is just to introduce these to you. Now, these 5 offerings in chapters 1 through 5, they are addressed to primarily the people of Israel. These are the offerings that the laity of Israel would come and offer. When you come to chapters 6 and 7, which we didn't look at yet, would be the priest's duties and regulations as to how they would perform them and how they would apply them as well. And so chapters 1 through 5 are for the people, the laity. And so Morales says that the first 3, so we have the burnt accession offering, the grain tribute offering, and the peace offering. The first 3, taken together and in order, he says, present an ideal worship scenario. Each one of these are voluntary and dubbed in Hebrew as a gift by fire, and every one of them will say that they are a sweet aroma to Yahweh. All right, so what is unique about these first 3, and let me highlight these, is that these are all voluntary. These 2, if you sin, if you get unclean, you have to do these. These are not voluntary, these are mandatory. All right, if you want your sins to be cleansed, if you want to be in God's presence, you have to do these. But these are voluntary. To give a burnt or an ascending sacrifice, a tribute, a gift, and peace, especially the peace one, that's the meal, that's the covenant meal. These are voluntary, and every one of them are described as being gifts of fire or gift by fire, and they are said to be a sweet aroma to Yahweh. So look at Leviticus 1:9 to see this. Of the burnt offering or the ascending offering, but he shall wash its entrails and its legs with water, and the priest shall burn all on the altar as a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire. There's that, by fire is a gift of fire, and it's a sweet aroma to the Lord. Or look at now chapter 2, verse 2. Speaking of the grain offering and the tribute offering, he shall bring it to Aaron's sons, the priest, one of whom shall take it from his handful of fine flour and oil with all the frankincense, and the priest shall burn it as a memorial on the altar, an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. There's the same thing. It's a gift of fire, and it's a sweet aroma to the Lord. And then you'll see this again in chapter 3, verse 5. And Aaron's son shall burn it, that is speaking of the peace offering, on the altar upon the burnt sacrifice, which is on the wood that is on the fire, as an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. And so you see that these three have this in common, that this is their way of worshiping. Now, we don't worship this way, do we? We have hymns, we have pastoral prayers, and we have, that's our liturgy, because in the new covenant, this is what God has told us to do. But in the old covenant, this was their liturgy. This was how they would worship. This was a voluntary way that they could offer sacrifice and praise to God and therefore come into his presence. Morales will say of the last two, so the 4 and 5, the sin and the trespass offering, he says of purification and reparation, what I might call a sin and trespass offering, they were expiatory in nature. Now that's a word that we use sometimes. Expiate means to remove. All right, so if you have sins, to expiate those sins is to remove those sins. It's not the same as propitiate. To propitiate means that you are satisfied, that the punishment that has been dealt out is satisfactory. You are satisfied with that. To expiate means to remove them completely. And so these are expiatory in nature. They are required as a remedy for particular sins. These are for particular sins. In practice, one or both of these expiatory sacrifices would precede the first three. In other words, before you could do these voluntary acts of worship, you had to deal with your sin. And God has made a way for you to do that. And so here's the mindset. You see this in chapter 9. So when the things are being instituted with Aaron in chapter 9. Look what it says in verse 2. Look for these words and understand that these are not just amalgamation of words. These are the 5 different sacrifices happening. Verse 2, he said to Aaron, take yourself a young bull as a sin offering. There's number 4. Okay? And a ram as a burnt offering, number 1, without a blemish, and offer them before the Lord. So you have to do number 4 before you can do number 1. And to the children of Israel you shall speak, saying, take a kid of the goat as a sin offering, number 4, and a calf and a lamb, both of the first year without blemish, as a burnt offering, number 1. So in other words, for the Israelites, just as the priest, you have to deal with your sin before you can deal with the ascending up to God. And verse 4, also a bull and a ram as a peace offering to a sacrifice before the Lord, and a grain offering, so that's 2 and 3 there, mixed with oil, for today the Lord will appear to you. Now, so this is the structure. You do number 4, so you can do number 1, and once you've done that, you can do numbers 2 and 3. 5 is a special case if you're unclean, and that's dealt with elsewhere here. And so we have the trespass offering is missing because it's specifically for the issue of contact with the unclean. And so before you could even do number 4, if you have come into something ritually unclean, which we will talk about later, you had to do number 5 first, and then you could do number 4, then you could do number 1, then you could do 2 and 3. All right, is it making sense? That there is a logic behind it. It's just, adjectives in front of the word offering, and I don't know what these mean. There are purposes behind these things. Here's what Morales says. He says, the liturgy, therefore, begins first with purification, with the purification offering, and is followed by the burnt or ascension offering, accompanied by the grain and tribute, and then concludes with the peace offering. The peace offering, number 3, this is the main one that we want to get to. All right, this is where we have the fellowship with God, when we enjoy a meal with God. We'll talk about that. So some of the notable features about these offerings, these 5. The final 2 offerings of sin and trespass offerings is always with a factor of blood, as one scholar called it, blood manipulation, how you apply the blood. It's to indicate the cleansing of sin, the removal, the expiation of sin. The first one, the burnt ascension offering, was of the entire animal, apart from the skin, that all of it was offered rather than just a portion. Other offerings will be just a portion of the animal. All of it was consumed on the fire and transformed into a pleasing aroma. Morales says this indicates the idea of full consecration, full setting apart for being in the presence of God. The peace offering, that's the one with the star there, number 3, was the only sacrifice that the worships partook of the sacrificial meat. In other words, if you came with a peace offering, in other words, if you reached finally to that ultimate end, you've done 5 because you can't do anything until you're ritually clean, so you could do 4 so you can have your sins forgiven, so you could do 1. And two, that you might have ultimately that peace offering with God. The peace offering was the only sacrifice that the worshipers partook of the sacrificial meat. And they would do this with their family. They would do this with their friends. They would do it for the poor. They would all come together under this one offering and have this fellowship, this meal, this covenant meal, as a communion meal and covenant meal. In other words, they would dine in God's presence. Do we do something like that? We're enjoying the presence of God, and Christ is our peace offering. We are communing and dining with God with the spiritual meal that he has given us in Jesus Christ. And here's the logic of what is happening here. The logic follows as expiation, consecration, and fellowship, or what another Old Testament scholar would say, justification, sanctification, and then communion with God, or just union. That's what we call, in the New Testament, the order of salvation, the Ordo Salutis. You mean to tell me that this was taught in the Old Testament, in Leviticus? Absolutely. Our doctrine of salvation is not just arriving de novo, out of nowhere, as a brand new concept. This was baked into the system of the Old Covenant that would teach and be a guide for the people of God. So Morales ends with this, and I'll conclude with this as well. I know I went long. The goal for Israel is fellowship and communion with God. That is the peace. Because Yahweh God is holy, the source of life, however, the requirement for communion with God is utter and complete consecration. That's complete sanctification. Yet before consecration to God can become a possibility, Israel's sins must be dealt with, expiated. Only a cleansed humanity may belong to Yahweh. The way to God, then, is through the bloody knife and a burning altar. If this is what Leviticus is doing in chapters 1 through 9, this is good stuff right here. It's not in our culture. It's not in our cult worship, but it is the liturgy that God used to illustrate for Israel. And this is good news, I think. All right, let us conclude with a quick prayer. God, we thank you for these things. Help us to understand them, to appreciate them. Lord, teach us these truths that are found in your word. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.